This sermon is from the series Psalms, God's Songbook for All Seasons. It contains sermons preached at Crossway Church over a number of years.
When I was a kid, I would watch the Looney Tunes, now this dates me, cartoons, and usually they would include an episode of Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. Now, if you're younger than me and you're unfamiliar with this, the premise is that the coyote is always trying to catch the Roadrunner, and guess what? He never can. I mean, it doesn't matter if that guy has a strapped to a rocket trying to catch up to him, or if the Roadrunner somehow gets tied up. The reality is the Roadrunner is always going to get free, and the coyote is always going to be disappointed. And quite frankly, that's the humor of it. He does his little meet, and then the coyote gets down. Now, I begin my sermon this morning because I think the reality is that sometimes life can feel that way. There's something that we want, and it feels like it's always out of our grasp. And no matter what we do, it seems like we chase after it, and we can't ever get it, and it's frustrating. And it's really frustrating to see others, I think, get it, especially those who aren't Christians, and maybe haven't, or even Christians who maybe haven't acted the best, or treated even us the best, get what they want when we don't get it. The reality is that can be a very, very frustrating thing when the wicked seem to win. Well, today we're continuing our sermon series on Psalm 37, and it's written by King David. In verse 25, he actually tells us that he's not young anymore, he's older, and it seems like he's trying to share his wisdom to people who are in exactly this situation. I'm going to read through all 40 verses, and we will look at that. But I want you to see how many times he notes that the wicked are seeming to get what they have a great life here on earth, and they aren't, and the angst that it causes him. But I also want you to see that this psalm is a little bit different. It is an acrostic, and so that's why it's longer. Every section kind of has a different letter of the alphabet that it begins with, and it's a rhetorical device to help people remember. But it feels more like a proverb. Matter of fact, when people look at this psalm, they don't know really how to characterize it. And some really call it a wisdom psalm because it has a bunch of different proverbial statements that seem to kind of stick. But I think it's important to us because oftentimes we can feel this way. We can feel and we can get frustrated that other people are succeeding and we're not, and it can drive us nuts. And I think this psalm gives us wisdom and things that we can do when we find ourselves in that moment. So if you want to turn with me to Psalm 37, again, I will read all 40 verses, and we will unpack it after that. Again, a reminder, in 2 weeks, we're going to start up the sermon series on the letters to the churches in Revelation. And so we'll look at Psalm 38 tomorrow, and then our next Sunday, and then after that, we'll begin that series. This is the word of the Lord. Psalm 37 of David, do not fret because of those who are evil, or be envious of those who do wrong. For like the grass, they will soon wither, like green plants, they will soon die away. Trust in the Lord and do good, dwell in the land and enjoy safe pasture. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your ways to the Lord, trust in him, and he will do this. He will make your righteous reward shine like dawn, your vindication like a noonday sun. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. Refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret, it leads only to evil. For those who are evil will be destroyed, but those who hope in the Lord will inherit the land. A little while, and the wicked will be no more. Though you look for them, they will not be found. But the meek will inherit the land and enjoy peace and prosperity. The wicked plot against righteousness and gnash their teeth at them. But the Lord laughs at the wicked, for he knows their day is coming. The Lord draws the sword and bends the bow, to bring down the poor and the needy, to slay those who are always upright. But their swords will pierce their own hearts, and their bows will be broken. Better the little that the righteous have than the wealth of many wicked. For the power of the wicked will be broken, but the Lord upholds the righteous. The blameless spend their days under the Lord's care, and the inheritance will endure forever. In the times of disaster, they will not wither. In the days of famine, they will enjoy plenty. But the wicked will perish. Though the Lord's enemies are like the flowers of the field, they will be consumed. They will go up in smoke. The wicked borrow and do not repay, but the righteous give generously. Those the Lord blesses will inherit the land, but those he curses will be destroyed. The Lord makes firm the steps of the one who delights in him. Though he may stumble, he will not fall, for the Lord upholds him with his hand. I was young, and now I am old. Yet I've never seen the righteous forsaken for their children or their children begging for bread. They are always generous and lend freely. Their children will be a blessing. Turn from evil and do good, then you will dwell in the land forever. For the Lord holds the just and will not forsake the faithful ones. Wrongdoers will be completely destroyed. The offspring of the wicked will perish. The righteous will inherit the land and dwell in it forever. And the mouths of the righteous will utter wisdom, and their tongues speak what is just. The law of their God is in their hearts. Their feet do not slip. The wicked lie in wait for the righteous, intent on putting them to death. But the Lord will not leave them in the power of the wicked, or let them be condemned when brought to trial. Hope is in the Lord, and keep his way. He will exalt you to inherit the land. When the wicked are destroyed, you will see it. I have seen a wicked and ruthless man flourishing like a luxuriant native tree, but soon he passed away and was no more. Though I looked for him, he could not be found. Consider the blameless, observe the upright. A future awaits those who seek peace. But all sinners will be destroyed. There will be no future for the wicked. The salvation of the righteous comes from the Lord. He is their stronghold in times of trouble. Stronghold in times of trouble. The Lord helps them and delivers them. He delivers them from the wicked and saves them because they take refuge in him. Now, as I said, this psalm is kind of an interesting psalm. It is a little bit, one, it's 40 verses, which is longer than most psalms, and it doesn't have that prayer or worship song kind of feel. It has more of a proverbial sense. It has wisdom and statements about it. And so sometimes when you look at a text like this, it can be interesting to figure out how to find different themes in order to preach. Well, I think that the best way to do that is to actually look at the very opening verses. This psalm starts with a series of commands, and I think it actually forms a great outline for this text. It hits the three main things that are important. And the first one of those is that we need to resist worldliness and don't get worked up when the wicked seem to thrive. He says it right there, do not fret because of those who are evil or be envious of those who do wrong. Whether we like it or not, when David talks about this, the prosperity of the wicked, and when he says to not fret over it, he's admitting what can often happen inside of our hearts. He shows us that there's a deadly process that can take place and when we see others around us doing better than we want, and it's get those things that we want. And I think it's especially bitter when those people are maybe acting in a way that they shouldn't. We can say to ourselves, why is it that God's blessing them and not us? And there's can be a bitterness in it. And what we see here right off the bat is that David is telling us we need to fight this. And he lays out what this process is. The process begins with comparing ourselves to others. You notice how he says it? He says it, don't fret when they succeed. And it implies that someone is comparing themselves to those others, and they're doing that. You know, it's interesting when we compare ourselves, we don't often compare ourselves to those who are worse than us. When I get frustrated in life, it's not because I'm comparing myself to those in the Gaza Strip or those in the Ukraine or those who are living in third world countries who have nothing and are literally trying to scrounge for food and live in a hut. No, I compare myself to those above myself, whether it is their pay or whatever it is that they have that I want, and I compare myself to them, and I feel like I'm lacking. And David says right here in the very beginning that we need to be careful about that we need to root that out. He says, don't fret. Don't allow this kind of internal angst to happen inside of us because we're playing this comparison game with others. And so we have to be honest about this. A lot of our life is about comparison. I think, quite frankly, what we see in the rise of anxiety is the rise of social media. And studies have shown this, that the more that we see people's good life on social media, we never post about arguments we have or the bad lives. We just post about our trips and our great design projects that we've done, the good things, that we kind of trick ourselves into thinking that that's exactly what somebody's life is. And we need to watch that. We need to realize that there's this thing around us that's just trying to help us play the comparison game. Ads are the same way. They don't tell us, hey, look at your life. You're way better than the people in Gaza or the Ukraine, and be happy for it. No, they show us something that they think that we need to buy and then make us feel unworthy because we don't have it so that we buy it. That's what it is. And so there's all of these things around us that are trying to show us that we aren't living up to an expectation, and we need to be careful that we don't allow that attitude to seep into our hearts. So the psalmist says right off the bat, don't allow this fretting, this internal angst to happen around us because we see that people are doing better than ourselves. And we need to cut it off right there. And so the question that I think we can wrestle with this week as we think about this is, where am I tempted to compare my life to others instead of resting in God's plan for us? We all have these things that we think cause angst if we don't have it. It can be a relationship. It can be wealth. It can be a home. It can be a job. It can be whatever it is. We all have certain things that grab our attention, and we play the comparison game, and we feel lacking. And it can cause us this angst inside of ourselves. And so we need to ask ourselves, where are those areas? What are those things that easily grab our hearts? It's like Velcro. We have these hooks, and what are those things that can easily hook us? And to be honest about that, because if we're not honest about them, they can have more control over our lives than we admit. That's why the psalmist says, don't fret, don't be envious about them. And the reason, he says, is that comparison leads to envy. He says it right there in verse 1. Do not fret because those who are evil, or be envious of those who do wrong. And so what we see is there's an anxiety. The more that we compare with each other, the more this anxiety increases in ourselves because we feel like we don't measure up or we feel like we don't have. I got to tell you, one of the things that's always surprised me whenever I've traveled overseas, especially when I've traveled to overseas places where they have less than me, is how happy people's lives are. I look at their life and I may compare it to mine and think, man, I have way more, but there's a simplicity and there is something about them that just doesn't seem as envious. And I think it's because they're just trying to survive. And they don't have the energy to play the comparison game in envy. Maybe I just don't see it. But the reality is the more that we compare, the more that we grow envy. And so the psalmist says right off the bat, don't compare yourselves to the wicked or those around us. And also don't play the comparison game because it leads to envy. Don't be envious. And again, as I said, I think social media taps into this. I think advertising gets into this. I think just our American culture in general, where we have to prove that we have value and worth, and we have to let people know about that, all feeds into this. And we need to ask ourselves, do we need to get into this game? And the psalmist says, no, we really don't. And so today, again, the question that I want you to process is, what are the subtle forms of envy do I notice in my heart when others succeed? You know, it's interesting. I have a couple of websites that I like to go to in every week. And part of it is just they're websites that kind of expose stuff in the church. Part of it is because I want to know whatever scandals are happening so I don't get blindsided by it. But I have to admit there's a little bit of pride in me sometimes when I read it. It's like, oh, I'm not that person, and that makes me feel good. It's subtle, isn't it, how those kind of things can come in? No, I'm glad I haven't had a scandal, and I don't plan to. But that's a little bit of pride and right there, right? It's a way for us to have that. And I think that that's even a little subtle form of envy sometimes. And maybe that person had more success or whatever, and then they're kind of caught in it. And you can see that kind of producing that. There's subtle ways that we can envy, and there's also subtle ways that we can kind of move into that anger or bitterness phase. And I think that's really what going to that website shows me. It's like, oh, I'm better than them. And maybe there's a little bit more bitterness there than I would care to admit, or in a little bit of anger there that I care to admit. I think it's easy for us to think that would not be honest about the impact that envy can have. What happens is we compare ourselves, we find ourselves lacking, then we envy them, and then we grow kind of bitter and angry and frustrated that we don't have it. And it kind of snowballs into this thing. And so that's why the psalmist says, do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their things, and refrain from anger and turn from their wrath. Do you see that transition in verse 7 and 8? He says, don't fret when people succeed, when they carry out their wicked schemes. Refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret, it leads to evil. And I think we need to be honest about what goes on in our own hearts, that oftentimes when we envy, we can move to anger, and it can allow us to have a bigger impact on our lives than we care to admit. The psalmist says we need to do everything we can to look at our hearts in the mirror and ask ourselves those hard questions. And so the question for us to ponder, I think, this week is, how has comparison or envy produced anger or bitterness in me? Think about those times when you have those sudden bursts of anger or where there's a bitterness, and what's at the root behind it? My guess is that there's envy or feeling like you are not getting what you deserve. And the psalmist says it's important for us to do that. The other thing that he notes in this psalm, later in the psalm, is that anger and envy and bitterness can lead us to take advantage to others. When he describes the attitudes of the wicked, he said the wicked borrow and do not repay, but the righteous give generously. And normally when we play this comparison trap, we can kind of compare ourselves to others, and because they have more than we do and we have less, we kind of struggle with these emotions. And we kind of let ourselves off the hook and say, well, then because they have more, I'm entitled, and I'm going to be so focused on myself that we don't live generously, or in some cases even take advantage of others, where we borrow and we don't repay. Now, I think most of us would say we're trying to pay back our loans and do those kind of things, but maybe it's where we are just that mooch that always is known for being the person who asks for everything and never gives in return. They ask for something, but they never give the time to help. They ask for help, but never give the time to help. Or, there's so many different ways that this can happen, but there's easy ways that this can happen in our own lives, and I think we need to look at it and ask those tough questions. What are those ways that maybe we've allowed ourselves to let ourselves off the hook and not carry our own weight because anger and bitterness has seeped in? Now, it's interesting that the antidote to this is that it's not to take our eyes off of the other people and instead remember the proper perspective. And most of the psalm, quite frankly, is talking and reminding ourselves about this proper perspective. The whole middle section of the psalm really is. And I think that's the antidote to all of this. Sometimes we can get so caught up in this world that we think that this world is all that there is. And so when we see other people succeeding and we don't have the success that we think, it weighs us down. And really what it is us living our life not with the glimpse of the bigger picture and reminding ourselves that life is more than what it is right here. And that creates a discontentment and a lack of just being okay with what we've been given and what we've been blessed. Because we are discontent and unhappy, we keep on playing this game, and anger and bitterness and taking advantage of others can seep into our lives. And so the psalmist says, well, the thing that we need to do is to have the proper perspective. And so verse 2, right off the bat, he says, for like the grass, they soon will wither. Like green plants, they will soon die. And the fact of the matter is what he's reminding us is that even though it may seem that people who are against us may be succeeding, that their life is temporary. And he repeats this over and over again throughout the psalm. We see it in verses 9 and 10. We see it in verse 35 and 36. I've seen a wicked and ruthless man flourishing in a native tree, and then he's gone. And in verse 8, it says they'll be destroyed. In verse 2, it says they're going to wither. And so we remind ourselves that the people who maybe are wicked and whose life is in seeming to go well, that their life right now is the best it's ever going to be. But that isn't true for ourselves. We will get to experience a much better life. There's some truths that he remembers. It seems that those who are wicked in David's life were having power and control. And sometimes we can look at our society around us and not like what we see. It may seem even that the tides of political power and all this stuff is moving to the spot where there is all kinds of bad things happening and agendas or whatever the case may be. But Psalm 37 reminds us that no matter what happens, their power will be stripped away. He says, for the power of the wicked will be broken, but the Lord upholds the righteous. And he reminds us that especially those who have harmed us, that we need to remember that they will face God's judgment. Psalm 30, verse 7, verse 20 says, but the wicked will perish. And 30 says, all sinners will be destroyed. There will be no future for the wicked. And if you look at this in verses 12 through 17, I won't look at it that in depth because I don't want to beat a dead horse. There's all kinds of descriptions of how this is going to happen. But he says on the flip side, the righteous will have eternal reward. And as I said, this is a thing for us to remember. We see the gospel actually proclaimed in this psalm. Right off the bat, it's absolutely clear that the righteous will inherit the land and dwell in it forever. And this idea of the land is like the presence of God and being there. And the people of God will be there. And this is what the psalmist David reminds the people of. That no matter what their life may seem right now, no matter how defeated they may feel, that is not the way they will be for all eternity. And he reminds them of that. I want you to see, too, though, that he makes it absolutely clear that it's not because they do these great things. No, he ends with a pretty bold statement that their salvation is God's gracious gift. The salvation of the righteous doesn't come from their good deeds, and he's going to list a bunch of them that we can do in this psalm. We'll look at those in a minute. But rather, it comes as a gift of the Lord. It comes from the Lord. It's not that they're the stronghold and that they have all the power and the might. No, the Lord is their stronghold in their time of trouble. And what he's saying is that they can look forward to spending all eternity with God, not because of the great things that they've done, but rather because of who God is and how great he is. And last week, and when we looked at Psalm 36, we looked at some pretty amazing attributes of who God is, how he's faithful, how he's kind. Remember, there's this language that all of this permeates the world and everything touches it. And we see that continued here too. God is at work in our world even though we don't see it. And his salvation is a gift from us. He is our stronghold in the time of trouble. And the psalm ends by a statement of deliverance. He says the Lord helps them and delivers them. He delivers them from the wicked and he saves them because they take refuge in him. And again, it's not because of what they've done, but rather because of the strength of the Lord and what God has done. All they do is trust in him and take refuge of this. And so we know that Christ is the ultimate fulfillment of this promise. That's why John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him, whoever takes refuge in him, shall not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn this world, but to save the world through him." And so in this psalm, we see this statement. We see, again, a challenge to look at our own hearts and look at those attitudes that we can have when it seems like the wicked are succeeding or people are doing better than ourselves. And rather to have that eternal perspective, to not get so focused on ourselves, but rather to step back and see that God is at work and that he has provided us salvation. And as believers, we know that this salvation is ultimately in Christ. And when we know that the ultimate gift that we've been given is salvation and eternal life with God, then we live a different way. And this psalm very much works the same way as many of the New Testament letters. There's commands that are given, act this way, do this way, out of the reality of being saved. You don't do it to earn salvation. That's absolutely clear in the end of this psalm. It is only something that is a gift from God. God does all the work. But when we've been impacted by it, then we want to live our life in light of this new resurrection. And that's the other thing that we see the psalmist say over and over again. In Psalm 37, verse 3-5, he says, "Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and enjoy safe pasture. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your ways to the Lord and trust in him, and he will do this." And I think sometimes we can get so wrapped up in our eyes on everyone else that we don't take our stock of our own lives and just do the good things that God has done in front of us. And we forget that God has placed us in a time and a place for us to grow in our faith in him, but also to serve him. And the more that we can serve and the more that we can do, we actually find a deeper fulfillment in that. Doesn't mean that it's going to be easy or that we're not going to be stretched, but there's a beauty in it sometimes that can happen. And there's some things that he encouraged us to do in the midst of all this, the way that we can live this out. And the first one is to grow in patience. He says, "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him." Oftentimes, we're not still before the Lord. When we come to the Lord, really what we just want to do is give him a list of all the things that we want. Lord, I need you to do this, 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 and if you can do this, this would be great, and then this. Lord, I really like this. Really what it is bringing our own agenda. Now, it's good to bring those things to the Lord. Bring your requests. But maybe one of the challenges for us is that we can sit in silence and think about who God is and what he's done. And the more that we understand what God has done for him, the more that we ponder him, then the more patient we are. Because we remember that God is still at work in our lives. And so there is this charge to grow in patience. And I would say the more that we are in touch with God, the more patient we will be with other people. So where do you struggle most with the impatience towards God's timing? That's a question we can ask. Where do I struggle the most this week? And there's another thing that we're called to cultivate, and that is cultivate meekness. Now, meekness is a term that I think most of us don't go, hey, I'm meek, I'm great, I'm proud. Meek is not a word that we use very often. And sometimes it has this idea of more being a doormat and letting people walk over you. That's not really what meekness is. Meekness will speak when they need to speak, but they also will be quiet when they don't need to. It's a passive strength. When people respond to you in a negative way, you aren't quick to fire back, rather you're gracious. Meekness actually requires a lot of self-control and strength of will. I mean, we all have those urges when somebody comes at you just to give a good one-liner, or maybe I'm the only one who does. We want to fight fire with fire. We want to rather than being that calming influence and that fire extinguisher around them. And maybe that fire extinguisher is just keeping your mouth shut and not saying anything at all. That's the meekness. And in the Beatitudes, Jesus actually says a very similar thing to what we see in Psalm 37. But the meek will inherit the land and enjoy peace and prosperity. My guess is that when you see meekness in a good way, and you see those people who have the quiet strength, that they don't have to respond and be reactive, that you see the power and the impact that they can have. That is what we are called to do, to cultivate meekness. And it comes from the strength that we know with God. Part of it is we know that God is the ultimate judge, so we don't have to weigh in on everything. Part of it is we know that we're messed up, and so we're gracious to people because God has treated us with that kindness. Meekness is not being a doormat. Rather, it will speak up when there is injustice, but it won't fire off right off the bat, and we're called to cultivate it. So the question that I think a good question for us to ponder this week is, when am I most reactive with others? And what can I do to be more patient? The other thing that we can see in this psalm that's highlighted as a way that we can live out of the realities of the resurrection is to practice generosity. I love the comparison that he has in Psalm 37, verse 21. The wicked borrow and do not repay, but the righteous give generously. When you understand that salvation is the ultimate gift that God has given you, when you stop comparing yourself to those who have more and realize that how much you have, you don't hold the thing so tightly. You're more free with your time. You're more free with your finances. You're more free with everything because you realize like quite everything you have has been given from God. If I have an attitude of thankfulness for everything God has given me, and I realize that, man, I have way more than 90% of the world, then I'm going to be more free with my time or more free with those things. Because the fact of the matter is I'm not trying to achieve and to get something that somebody else has. And so I don't have to hold everything so tightly. And so one of the signs that we've been impacted by the love of God is that we're generous. Now, it doesn't mean that you can be generous with the church, and I want to thank you for your generosity as a church, quite frankly. But it can also be generous in our giving to other people, the time of allowing them of helping people out or helping those in need, and maybe no one even knows about it. But our goal is to practice generosity. That's what we're called to. Because God has been generous to us, and we don't want to hold on to those things tightly. And so we're generous to other people. So the question I have for you this week to think about is, when's the last time someone's unexpected kindness made a lasting impact on you? And how might you pass that feeling on to somebody else today? I know I have a lot of questions, but I think this psalm is just introspective. It's easy we can just blow past it, or we can try and incorporate the wisdom. And so what we see is that these are some of the questions that we have. And the last thing that we see in this psalm that we can do is just to put our hope and trust in the Lord. It says, take light in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Now, it doesn't always mean that we will get what we want. But desire is more having joy, no matter what the circumstances is. And I love later in the psalm, it actually says, look, they're going to stumble, but they won't fail. That's the righteous. And there will be many times where life will not go the way that we expect it to, and we will have to deal with all kinds of unexpected things. But that doesn't mean that God isn't at work in our heart, and it doesn't mean that we can't take delight in the Lord in all of it. Now, how do we do that? I mean, how can we proactively take delight in the Lord? And I tell you that because this is actually a command. It's not just a statement of fact. Hey, take delight and he'll give you the desires of the heart. No, he's saying you need to work at trying to take delight and to put your hope in the Lord. This is what you need to work towards. Well, how do you do this? Well, there's a couple of things that I've thought about as I was wrestling with this. A few suggestions. One is to create a gratitude list. Just write down the things that you're thankful for. If you're wrestling with actually not being content with life, and you see all these different things that you want and you're not getting, maybe pause and say, Lord, I know that this shouldn't be the attitude of my heart. I know that this is something that I need to wrestle with. Help me see the good things that I have to be thankful for. And spend time actually writing down that list. Psychologists will tell you that this is a powerful tool to help you take delight in our life, because we focus on the things that we have and the blessings that we've been given rather than the things that we don't have. And this is countercultural. Maybe begin or close each day pausing and thinking about one thing that has happened that you can be grateful for. There may be all kinds of terrible things that have happened, but my guess is that you can find one or two things that you're like, man, this was really hard, but yet I saw some beauty in this. Maybe it's just somebody taking notice of the difficult thing that you're doing and asking you how are you doing and actually listening. Maybe it's just a sense of encouragement that somebody said, I just want you to know I see this. It could be all kinds of different things, but just take stock of that. And the last one is maybe in your time of prayer, rather than just telling God all the things that you want to do, asking him, one, to cultivate this joy, and two, actually giving thanks to him in prayer for those things that you've given him or that he's given you. All of these things will help us cultivate and deepen our hope and joy in the Lord. And this is what the psalmist says. We will face all kinds of situations where it feels like life isn't going the way that we want it to, and the people that are getting all the success shouldn't be getting it. And it can lead us down the path of feeling bitter and angry. The psalmist says we need to cut that off at the beginning. Cut it off at the root. Don't even play the comparison game. Don't let it move to envy, move to anger, and this outward attitude. But instead, have that eternal perspective and remember the great gift that God has given you, salvation, which comes from Christ himself. That's where our hope is. That is where we ultimately find it. And then live out of that. Live out of that gift that you've been given and the joy that you do. Grow in patience. Grow in not being reactive, in meekness. Practice generosity. Don't hold to your things tightly, but ultimately put our hope and trust in the Lord. That's the only thing that will get us through. Let's pray.
You have just watched a sermon from Crossway Church in Battleground, Washington. We hope that you enjoyed it, and we'd love to have you come join us for a worship service on Sunday at 10 a.m. at 311 North Parkway Avenue in Battleground, Washington. If you'd like to find more information about us online, you can find it at crosswaychurchwa.com.